we in the government space are really not very good at buying digital services. Certainly not consulting, development work, all those types of things. We're pretty slow at it, and frankly, our failure rates are through the roof, or delivering less value than expected. So we're actually testing some of that out now to see if it's a different line of business. But it's a passion of mine because I don't know if this happens to any of the other folks on this call, but for us, we'll get into an agile engagement and we've got existing folks on the ground, existing contractors, vendors, and the contracts are set up in a way that frankly inhibit good agility. So I've come to believe, just like I'd say, you talked about Brian with leadership, that you have to have that leadership up front. If you've got contract structures that aren't supportive of good agility, you end up with another sort of early mess that you try to clean up as you go along, and sometimes you just can't do it.
How often would you say that happens in government today?
Right now, it happens a lot. I'm hoping it'll start happening less. Part of why it happens a lot is because so many of the contracting officers, the people responsible for buying, they just don't understand what Agile is. So they take the old contracts, these big, huge, hundreds of pages statements of work, they put them out and they ask for paper responses. You can already see in this group, how that's out of line with agility. And you've got a separate requirements team from a design team, an IV&V, a testing team, different team doing deployments. Again, you can kind of see already where we're set up to make a lot of the things that we preach very, very difficult to achieve.
So what's a solution? If you had the elevator pitch to make that work, what does that look like?
We have to start early. We have to really, to me, install agility from the outset. And some of that means training. And frankly, because it's such a complex space, we need to coach just like we coach our Scrum teams, our SAFe teams, less teams, whatever your form of agility, Kanban, whatever you're doing. I think we need that same level of engagement and coaching for the people before they award these humongous, sometimes billion-dollar contracts that are structured in a way where they're already set up for failure.
So you mentioned a couple of frameworks in that. Is there any one framework that's more favorable to making that a reality in government? Is it depending on the situation? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I think we really, in government, a lot of places, we want the contractors, the vendors to be able to bid what they think is the best fit for the work. I will say certainly team level Scrum dominates in government just like it does everywhere else. Kanban's got this much of a foothold, which is a shame because I think it probably fits in a lot of places. And then, of course, from a scale perspective, SAFe completely dominates within the government. And unfortunately, things like Scrum at Scale, less disciplined Agile, some of those other areas, I think, get much less play than they probably deserve.
So there's the Agile contracting thing, right? The whole acquisition part, right? And there's also this aspect that I've been exposed to regarding the provider claiming that they're Agile, but the results don't indicate that. There was that Defense Innovation Board, some years back that came up with the, the Agile BS document. Could you add any more perspective on that, what you're seeing?
And I think this is where some pride in being in this space, that they've done some outstanding work getting industry and who have been, even the title, very in your face, but very honest. So we have a huge problem. I'd be interested, again, I don't see as much in the industry probably as all of you, but it's a huge issue. And it's very frustrating as an Agilist to see cases where people claim agility. Every contractor now, every vendor has to say, yes, we're Agile. You won't be able to bid on this work if you're not. And their agility is essentially they sat in a 2-day class. They know some of the terms. and unfortunately, they can't deliver the results, Peter, much like you said.
So as a small business, we've attempted to make inroads through that channel, right? Because the government and military, right, in particular, has certain set-asides for small businesses. What we have found as a challenge there, because you said like the monolithic, well, even at the smaller level, where there are requests for smaller deliverables, those requests, we have found it very challenging to find requests that go beyond the delivery of a product. So in other words, finding a request from the government that you can respond to that's asking for the type of work that Dave's involved in, right? Like, hey, we need to transform this department or this division, or we need to understand more about agile acquisition or things like that. We have found it almost a mystery when we speak to the small business representatives from the government side and from the major, the primes, the major contractors for the military. It's a bit of a mystery to them when we say, look, no, we're not selling you a product, we're selling you a new way of thinking about the work. And they haven't been able to process that yet. So the monolithic aspect of it, when you look at it, a single request for a major deliverable, there might be elements in it that have to do with administrative project management. But we have not found it easy to find those types of requests that include elements of the work needing to be carried out in a new way, in an agile manner. That's what we have found. So Dave, Brian, I don't know if you've seen anything different or not, but it's surprisingly missing, from the landscape there.
Following up on your statement regarding, well, you mean you're not selling me a process? You mean you're not selling me a product? Well, therefore, you must be selling me consulting time. So our agreement must be based on hours consumed, right? And the question, it begs the question at that point, are we agreeing on effort, or are we agreeing on value delivery or output? How do we address that in an organization that might not have the perspective yet to understand the difference between the two?
I think that the truth of the matter is that we're in an output-driven world. People actually, and I've talked to people in government, and they've been very frank with me and told me that the outcomes sometimes don't matter from a procurement perspective as much as the outputs do. So they're contracting to get this thing that they can show for the money that they've spent. And that's the primary concern. I don't think that we're in a position to be able to re-educate people on that, because their bonuses are tied to that. I mean, I looked at I don't know if you've ever seen the OPM guidelines for performance management, but they're all based upon activities and showing evidence of those activities. So if you're going to be judged that way on activities and outputs, there's no incentive to actually change to anything else.
I was going to say, Brian, I'm fascinated with what's going on in the federal space, just like the structure of our government, though, right? If you look at more a localized perspective, like state and county governments, I do see more flexibility there in those places, and most likely because it's a smaller entity. There's a case study from, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago about Washington State and how the deputy CIO brought in these agile practices and how they're going to run the finances of the state, get stakeholder buy-in, make their product backlog visible, things like that, because there was someone who was in a position of authority that could do that. When you're at the federal level, I think it's a little more complicated, doesn't it?
I think it's a lot more complicated.
I was using understatement to make some impact. Right?
What you have to understand too is that I think in all sectors and for all entities, there is kind of a going knowledge domain information that you kind of absorb and pick up and are expected to learn. And traditionally, government has been, ironically, one parts of it invent a lot of the things that we actually employ, but the rest of the government has been traditionally behind the private sector. And so a lot of the concepts that we are going over, we've been doing Agile for years, many parts of the government, we're their first exposure to it. This video may be their first exposure to it. They're that behind. And so I guess the unfamiliarity with some of the techniques and some of the principles behind it, it makes change a little bit more difficult, a little bit slower.
And I think we're hearing a common theme, right? So time check, we're 1 minute over to keep the time box. I'm gonna do my best at summarizing what I've heard. And we started out with the initial procurement, and that the key to that is really educating the individuals that are going to be evaluating that acquisition, that initial acquisition, that they are familiar with the Agile mindset so that they know what to look for. And then that segue into the discussion of being able to be Agile within the project itself so that there isn't a monolithic approach to delivery or purchases, so that there's some inspecting and adapting that can happen there. And then the third was this concept of being able to, within the individuals that are participating and leading the change, that they are rebels in themselves, right? To Dave's point, that there are change agents and they need to be representing change in that organization, not just doing it the traditional way, right? Did I miss any other key takeaways? Those were three that I was able to pile here.
But I like Dave's comment about it's really not that much different. And everything we've said about the government, there's plenty of the same type of examples, probably in the same proportion in the private sector. So
yeah, great point. And that it might not be that different, it's just more pronounced, right? And there was a fourth one there. Keeping myself honest, we talked about it being value driven and not necessarily output or effort driven. That there's an agreement in terms of that deliverable that is valuable and not managing time, perhaps. Right. All right. With that, thank you for being generous about letting me blow the time box. We'll convene again next week. Thank you, everyone.